Lee Tae-ho stepped off the transport shuttle and into the massive corridors of Kepler Station. His worn sneakers squeaked against the polished metal floors as he pulled his backpack higher on his shoulders. The station was unlike anything Kai had ever seen back in Seoul. Curved walls stretched endlessly in every direction, glowing with soft blue light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Strange symbols floated in holographic displays above his head, automatically translating into Korean as he walked beneath them. Xenobiology Lab Level 47 appeared in glowing text, pointing down a corridor lined with transparent aluminum windows. Through them, Tae-ho could see the vast emptiness of space, dotted with distant stars and the occasional passing ship. Some vessels looked familiar from his Earth textbooks, but others defied description. Organic curves that seemed grown rather than built, crystalline structures that caught starlight like prisms, and sleek metallic forms that moved without any visible propulsion. As he made his way through the academy halls, Tae-ho became acutely aware of the stares following him. Groups of alien students would stop their conversations mid-sentence when he passed, their various forms of eyes tracking his movement. Some whispered in languages his universal translator couldn't quite catch, while others simply watched in fascination. Near the lab entrance, he overheard a cluster of Veltari students talking in hushed tones. Their bodies looked like living crystal sculptures, light refracting through their translucent forms in rainbow patterns. The one called Krixtal was gesturing nervously with arms that sparkled like cut diamonds. "I heard humans come from a Class 13 world," she whispered, her voice creating a sound like wind chimes. "That's the same classification as the nightmare worlds of the Outer Rim." Her companion, another Velthari with deep blue crystal formations, growing from his shoulders, nodded gravely. "My instructor at the Preparatory Academy told us their planet has creatures that hunt in coordinated groups. They call them wolves, and apparently humans used to compete with them for territory." "That cannot be true," interrupted Vrakmore, a creche student whose feathers were currently a nervous shade of pale yellow. His beak clicked as he spoke, and his large eyes darted toward Tae-ho. Surely no sentient species could evolve alongside pack hunters and survive to reach space travel. Tae-ho pretended not to hear as he approached the lab door. His orientation materials had warned him that his human heritage would attract attention, but he hadn't expected this level of fascination mixed with fear. Back on Earth, the selection process for the Galactic Exchange Program had been incredibly competitive. Only 12 humans had been chosen from the entire planet, and he was the only one assigned to the prestigious Advanced Xenobiology program. The laboratory doors hissed open, revealing a space that took his breath away. The room was enormous, with a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time view of the cosmos above. Workstations were arranged in an amphitheater style, each equipped with holographic displays and analysis equipment that looked centuries ahead of anything Earth had produced. But what drew his attention immediately were the containment units lining the far wall. Each unit was roughly the size of a small room, with energy barriers that shimmered like heat waves. Through the transparent barriers, he could make out shapes moving in artificial environments. One unit contained what looked like a living shadow that seemed to absorb light around it. Another held something that resembled a cross between a spider and a flower, its petals opening and closing rhythmically. A third unit housed a creature that appeared to be made entirely of electricity, crackling bolts dancing between its limbs. Professor Quindar stood at the front of the lab, his forearms moving independently as he organized his lesson materials. Thanexari was impressive even by alien standards, nearly 8 feet tall with deep purple skin that seemed to contain swirling galaxies of tiny lights. His primary arms handled a holographic display, while his secondary arms sorted through data. Tablets. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades studying the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. "Welcome to Advanced Xenobiology," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the lab's acoustics. "I see we have some new faces today, including our first human students." His four eyes turned toward Tae-ho and then located Kim So-min, who was sitting near the back. She gave Tae-ho a subtle wave, another Korean student from Busan who had been selected for the program. Today's lesson focuses on predator-prey relationships in extreme environments, Professor Quindar continued. The specimens you see behind me represent some of the most successful apex predators, from worlds classified as hostile to most galactic species. We will observe their hunting behaviors, defensive mechanisms, and adaptation strategies. The alien students around Taiho shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He noticed how Krixtal's crystalline form seemed to dim slightly, while Vrakmor's feathers had turned an even paler shade of yellow. A group of Delphani students, aquatic beings who wore specialized atmosphere suits filled with their homeworld's methane-based air, huddled closer together, their tentacles writhing with apparent anxiety. Safety protocols are absolutely paramount, the professor emphasized, his secondary arms highlighting emergency procedures on the holographic display. These containment fields are powered by 3 redundant systems. Each creature has been sedated to reduce aggressive responses. However, I want to stress that these are not domestic animals or specimens that have been declawed or defanged. These are genuine apex predators from worlds where survival requires constant vigilance. Professor Quindar was in the middle of explaining the hunting patterns of the shadow stalker when the first warning signs appeared. The holographic displays around the lab began flickering slightly, their usual steady glow becoming erratic. Taeho noticed it first. Growing up in Seoul during the frequent power outages had made him sensitive to electrical irregularities. He glanced at Somin across the room, who had also picked up on the subtle changes. As you can observe, the professor continued, pointing at the creature that seemed to bend light around itself. The shadow stalker from Omega Centauri uses photon manipulation to become nearly invisible to most species' visual spectrum. Suddenly, the station shuddered. It was subtle at first, like the feeling of a subway train passing far underground, but then the vibration intensified. The lights in the lab dimmed for a split second before returning to normal. Several alien students looked around nervously, their various appendages and sensory organs twitching with alarm. Vrakmor's feathers, which had been a cautious yellow throughout the lesson, suddenly shifted to bright orange, a clear sign of distress in creche physiology. "Professor," he chirped, his voice higher than usual, "is that normal for the station?" "Just routine maintenance," Professor Quindar replied, though his secondary arms were now discreetly checking his emergency protocols tablet. These deep space stations occasionally need to adjust their orbital positioning, but Taeho could see the concern in the professor's multiple eyes. Having grown up watching science fiction movies with his grandfather, he had learned to recognize the signs of impending disaster. The way the professor's skin patterns shifted from steady purple to a more agitated violet, the subtle increase in the humming of the station's systems, the way the artificial gravity seemed to fluctuate slightly, all of it pointed to something more serious than routine maintenance. The lesson continued for another 10 minutes with Professor Quindar explaining the territorial behaviors of a creature that looked like a cross between a dragon and a praying mantis. The alien students were taking notes on their various recording devices when the real problem struck. A massive power surge swept through the station. Every light in the lab blazed blindingly bright for 3 seconds before plunging the room into emergency lighting. The red backup illumination cast eerie shadows across the walls, making the containment units look like glowing prison cells. Sparks erupted from several control panels, and the smell of burning electronics filled the air. "What was that?" Krixtal asked, her crystalline form now completely colorless with fear. Before anyone could answer, a sound like breaking glass echoed through the lab. But this wasn't the gentle tinkling of a dropped beaker. This was the sharp, violent crack of high-energy containment fields failing under stress. Professor Quindar's 4 arms moved with practiced efficiency as he activated his emergency console. "Class, remain calm and move to the designated safe zones," he announced, though his voice carried an edge of urgency that contradicted his words. The largest containment unit, positioned at the far end of the lab, began to emit a high-pitched, whining sound. Warning lights flashed around its perimeter as the energy barrier flickered like a candle in the wind. Through the transparent walls, they could see the creature inside becoming agitated. The Void Ripper had been resting in a corner of its artificial environment, but now it was pacing back and forth with increasing intensity. Unit 7 showing critical failure, Professor Quindar reported into his communication device, requesting immediate backup power to containment systems. The response came back filled with static. All backup systems are currently engaged. With primary hull breach on level 23. Estimated repair time 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Tejo felt his stomach drop. The containment field was already flickering more frequently, and the Void Ripper was now throwing itself against the barrier with growing desperation. Everyone moved to the emergency stations now, the professor shouted, abandoning all pretense of calm. The alien students scrambled toward the reinforced alcoves built into the lab walls. These safe zones were designed to protect observers during particularly dangerous experiments, but they had never been intended as shelter from a completely uncontained apex predator. The Void Ripper slammed against its failing barrier one final time. The impact created a spiderweb of cracks across the energy field, and then, with a sound like thunder, the containment unit went completely dark. For a moment, the lab was silent, except for the emergency alarms now wailing throughout the station. Then, emerging from the shadows of its former prison, came the Void Ripper. The creature was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Its body was sleek and muscular, built like a perfect killing machine. 6 powerful legs ended in claws that could slice through metal plating, while its elongated head housed a mouth filled with teeth, designed for tearing through armor and bone. But what made it truly alien were the bioluminescent stripes that pulsed along its midnight black hide like living neon signs, and the cluster of eyes that could track multiple targets simultaneously. The moment it fully emerged from its containment, "Unit!" The creature's head snapped toward the huddled students. Its multiple eyes dilated as it processed the heat signatures, chemical sense, and electromagnetic fields radiating from the terrified aliens. Every instinct, honed by millions of years of evolution on one of the galaxy's most dangerous worlds, told it that it was surrounded by prey. Krigstal's crystalline form became completely transparent, a Velthari defense mechanism that unfortunately made her even more visible under the emergency lighting. Vrakmor was making high-pitched distress calls that his species used to warn their flocks of aerial predators. The Delphani students were releasing clouds of defensive pheromones that only served to further agitate the Void Ripper. Security. "Teams are en route," Professor Quindar announced, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Estimated arrival time 2 minutes. Nobody move. Do not make sudden gestures or sounds." But it was already too late. The Void Ripper had locked onto the scent of fear filling the room, and its predatory instincts were fully engaged. It began to move forward with the fluid grace of a creature that had never known failure in the hunt, its bioluminescent stripes pulsing in patterns that seemed to hypnotize its prey. While chaos erupted around him, Tejo's mind shifted into a different mode entirely. The screaming alarms, the panicked chittering of his alien classmates, the professor's frantic commands, all of it faded into background noise as his focus narrowed to the predator before him. This was a skill he had learned not in any classroom, but during countless childhood trips to his grandfather's mountain village near Jirisan National Park. His grandfather, Park Min-soo, had been a forest ranger for 40 years before retiring. The old man had taught Tejo something that no textbook could: how to read the language that all predators spoke, regardless of their planet of origin. "Watch the eyes first," his grandfather had always said. "Then the shoulders. The body tells you what the mind is planning." The Void Ripper's multiple eyes were darting between targets, but there was something desperate in their movement. Its shoulders were tense, not with aggression, but with uncertainty. The bioluminescent stripes along its hide weren't pulsing in the steady rhythm of a confident hunter. They were flickering erratically, like a distress signal. Tejo's breathing slowed automatically, drawing on techniques he had learned during his mandatory military service. In the Korean army, they had trained soldiers to remain calm under extreme stress, to think clearly when others panicked. But more than that, he was remembering every nature documentary he had ever watched, every encounter with wild animals back home. "Somin," he whispered, barely audible above the alarms. His voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had made a decision. "Remember the tigers at Everland Zoo. Kim So-min's head turned slightly toward him. She had been pressed against the emergency barrier with the other students, but at his words her posture began to change. Back in Busan, her family had owned a veterinary clinic that specialized in exotic animals. She had grown up around creatures that most people feared, learning to read their body language and emotional states. The male that got loose during the thunderstorm, she whispered back, understanding flooding her voice. Exactly, same situation, scared, displaced, defensive. During their first year at Seoul National University, they had both volunteered at Everland's animal research program. Taeho remembered the incident vividly. A massive Siberian tiger had escaped its enclosure during a severe storm, not out of aggression, but because the thunder and lightning had triggered its flight response. The animal had been found cowering in a maintenance shed, more terrified than dangerous. The Void Ripper took another step forward and several alien students whimpered in terror. Crystal was now so transparent she was almost invisible, while Vrakmor's feathers had turned completely white, a creche coloration that indicated absolute panic. The creature's head swiveled toward the sounds, its ears twitching at each new noise. But then something extraordinary happened. The Void Ripper's attention snapped toward Taeho, and for a moment the creature went completely still. Where it expected to sense the sharp chemical signature of fear that was radiating from every other being in the room, it instead encountered something else entirely. Taeho's scent carried no fear, no panic, no prey-like submission. Instead, there was a calm confidence that spoke of a creature comfortable with danger, familiar with predators, unimpressed by threats. It was the scent signature of something that had never learned to run from apex predators because it had never needed to. Slowly, deliberately, Taeho rose from his position behind the workstation. His movements were fluid and controlled, like a martial artist beginning a form. Every gesture was calculated to project calm authority rather than challenge or submission. The alien students watched in absolute horror as their supposedly fragile, human classmate began walking toward the most dangerous predator in the lab. "Taeho, no," Professor Quindar hissed, his forearms reaching toward emergency controls that might activate some kind of protective barrier. "Get back to the safe zone immediately." But Taeho ignored the professor's command completely. His attention was focused entirely on the Void Ripper, reading every subtle shift in its posture, every flicker of its bioluminescent stripes. The creature was watching him now with the kind of intense focus that predators reserved for other predators. Not prey, but a potential rival or threat. As he moved closer, Taeho extended his right hand slightly, palm facing downward in a gesture that was neither aggressive nor submissive. It was a position that said, "I see you, I respect you, but I am not afraid of you." At the same time, he began making a sound deep in his throat. Not quite a growl, but something primal and resonant that seemed to vibrate through the air. The sound was something he had learned from his grandfather, who had used it to calm aggressive dogs and even once memorably, a wild boar that had wandered into their village. It was a vocalization that existed somewhere between human speech and animal communication, carrying undertones that spoke to evolutionary memories buried deep in the brain stem. The Void Ripper's head tilted slightly, its multiple eyes focusing on this strange creature that smelled like a predator, moved like a predator, but looked like nothing in its evolutionary memory. The bioluminescent stripes along its hide began to pulse more slowly, shifting from the rapid flicker of distress to something approaching curiosity. For the first time since the containment breach, the creature stopped moving forward. Its powerful muscles remained coiled and ready, but the desperate edge of panic was beginning to fade from its posture. It was still dangerous, still capable of killing everyone in the room within seconds, but it was no longer acting purely on instinct. So-min, recognizing the change in the situation, began to slowly rise from her own position. Her movements mirrored Taeho's calm confidence, drawing on her own experiences with frightened animals. Together, the two humans presented something the Void Ripper had never encountered: prey that refused to act like prey, creatures that met its gaze without flinching and approached without running. The alien students watched in stunned silence as the predator and the humans entered into a strange, silent communication that transcended species barriers and spoke to something far older than civilization. The emergency alarms continued their shrill warning, But inside the xenobiology lab, an eerie calm had settled over the scene. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the life support systems and the soft breathing of the Void Ripper as it studied the human standing before it. Taeho could feel the weight of dozens of alien eyes watching him, but his focus remained entirely on the predator. The creature's bioluminescent stripes had shifted from the rapid, chaotic flickering of panic to something more measured and thoughtful. It was like watching a conversation conducted in light. The patterns flowing along its midnight black hide spoke of confusion, curiosity, and a growing sense of recognition. This wasn't the terrified thrashing of prey or the defensive posturing of a cornered animal. This was something far more complex. Taeho's mind drifted back to a cold winter morning 3 years ago when he had accompanied his grandfather on a routine patrol of the mountain trails near their village. They had encountered a pack of wild dogs that had been raiding farms in the valley below. The pack leader, a massive mixed breed with scars across its muzzle, had stood its ground as they approached. But instead of showing fear or aggression, his grandfather had done something unexpected. He had acknowledged the animal as an equal. "Never look away first," his grandfather had whispered that day, "but never stare with challenge either. Look, with respect, like you would look at another person you've just met." Now facing a creature from another world entirely, Taeho found himself using the same principles. His eyes met the Void Ripper's multiple gazes steadily, without flinching or showing dominance. He was simply present, calm, and unafraid. The creature took a cautious step closer, and Taeho noticed something remarkable happening: the panic pheromones that had been flooding the room from the terrified alien students seemed to have no effect on the Void Ripper now. Instead, it was focused entirely on the strange scent signature coming from the two humans, a mix of confidence, curiosity, and something that registered as familiar predator recognition. So-min began to move, rising slowly from her position near the emergency barrier. Her movements were a perfect mirror of Taeho's controlled confidence. During her time at the veterinary clinic in Busan, she had learned to approach frightened animals with what her father called quiet authority, the ability to project calm leadership without aggression. "Remember what we learned about pack dynamics," she whispered, barely audible. "Alpha doesn't mean aggressive, it means responsible." As she joined Taeho, the Void Ripper's attention split between them. Its head turned slightly, taking in this new development. Two creatures that smelled like predators, moved like predators, but showed no signs of territorial aggression toward each other. In the creature's experience, apex predators were solitary hunters that barely tolerated others of their kind. This was something new. "Easy now," Taeho murmured, his voice carrying the same tone he had used with injured animals back home. It wasn't the high-pitched baby talk voice that humans often used with pets, but something deeper and more respectful. "You're scared and confused, I get it. This place doesn't smell right, doesn't feel right, but you're safe here." The words themselves meant nothing to the Void Ripper, but the tone carried meaning that transcended language barriers. It was the voice of someone who understood what it meant to be a predator, who recognized the burden of always being alert, always being ready to fight or flee. Professor Quindar, watching from his position at the emergency controls, was frantically working to establish a temporary containment field. His forearms moved across holographic interfaces with practiced efficiency, but his eyes kept darting toward the impossible scene unfolding before him. In 30 years of xenobiology research, he had never seen anything like this. The Void Ripper's breathing had synchronized with Taeho's slow, steady rhythm. Its bioluminescent stripes were now pulsing in a pattern that xenobiology textbooks would have identified as curious investigation rather than hostile threat assessment. The creature was learning, adapting, recognizing that these strange beings represented something outside its normal categories of prey, predator, or threat. Taeho began to move, not toward the creature, but at an angle that would guide it toward the area where Professor Quindar was setting up the temporary containment system. His movement was subtle, almost like a dance step, creating a path without forcing the issue. It was a technique his grandfather had used to guide lost hikers back to safe trails, create the right option, and let them choose it. the Void Ripper. Followed, not because it was being herded or controlled, but because the human's movement suggested a direction that felt safe and purposeful. So Min moved in parallel, creating a corridor of calm confidence that the creature could follow. "That's it," Taeho said softly. "You're doing great. Just a little further." Behind them, Crixtal had become visible again, her crystalline form, still pale but no longer transparent with terror. Vrakmor's feathers had shifted from panic white to a cautious yellow-green. The other alien students watched in amazement as their human classmates accomplished something that should have been impossible. They were having a conversation with an apex predator. When they reached the temporary containment area, Taeho did something that made Professor Quindar's heart skip a beat. He extended his hand toward the Void Ripper, not to touch it, but in a gesture of invitation toward the containment field. The creature looked at the energy barrier, then at Taeho, then at the barrier again. Its bioluminescent stripes flickered in what almost looked like consideration. Then, moving with the fluid grace that had made it the apex predator of its homeworld, the Void Ripper walked calmly into the temporary containment field. As the barrier activated around it, the creature settled into a resting position, its stripes now pulsing with the slow, steady rhythm of relaxation. It looked at Taeho through the energy field, and if such a thing were possible, its expression seemed almost grateful. The lab erupted in a sound that was part gasp, part cheer, and part hysterical laughter. Every alien student in the room released the breath they had been holding, creating a symphony of relief in dozens of different languages and vocal patterns. The heavy blast doors of the xenobiology lab exploded inward with a thunderous crash, and 6 heavily armed security officers stormed into the room. They wore full combat armor that gleamed under the emergency lighting, their weapons charged and ready to face down a rampaging apex predator. The team leader, a massive Corvan warrior whose species was renowned throughout the galaxy for their combat prowess, had his plasma rifle trained and scanning for threats. "Where's the hostile?" he barked, his translator rendering his guttural language into standard galactic. "We detected massive panic pheromones and predator alert signals from this sector, but instead of the bloodbath they had expected to find, the security team was greeted by an almost surreal scene of calm. Taeho was sitting casually on a lab stool, his datapad in hand as he made notes about the Void Ripper's behavior patterns. The creature itself was curled up in the temporary containment field like an oversized cat, its bioluminescent stripes pulsing in the slow, steady rhythm of deep relaxation. The security team leader's weapon arm slowly lowered as he processed what he was seeing. Behind his helmet's visor, his 3 eyes blinked in confusion. "What? What happened here?" Professor Quindar stepped forward, his 4 arms gesturing helplessly as he struggled to find words. "The human student. He—" The professor paused, looking at Taeho with something approaching awe. "How did you do that?" "In 40 years of xenobiology research, I have never seen anyone establish communication with a Class X predator. The theoretical models suggest it should be impossible." So-Min, who was helping to organize the scattered lab equipment, looked up with a grin that was equal parts pride and amusement. "On Earth we call it reading the room," she said, her tone casual as if discussing the weather. "When you grow up around creatures that can kill you, you learn to understand them pretty quickly. It's basic survival." The security team was now completely lowering their weapons, staring at the 2 humans with expressions that mixed admiration and disbelief. The team leader removed his helmet, revealing the scarred face of someone who had seen combat across dozens of worlds. "I've been in security for 20 years, he said slowly. "I've faced down Nexus Raiders, Gamma Pirates, and Void Spawn, but I've never seen anything like this." Within the hour, word of the incident had spread beyond the laboratory. The Academy's internal communication network was buzzing with reports that seemed too incredible to believe. Students in dormitories across the station were sharing hastily recorded video clips from their personal devices. Faculty members were calling emergency meetings to discuss the implications. By evening, security footage of the encounter had been uploaded to the Galactic Academic Network. The video showed Taeho calmly approaching the Void Ripper, establishing some form of communication, and guiding it back to containment without a single act of violence or coercion. Within hours, the footage had been viewed millions of times, across hundreds of worlds. The Xenobiology Department of the University of Centauri Prime requested copies for their research archives. The Predator Studies Institute on Vega Station demanded a full report. Even the Galactic Council's Committee on Dangerous Species Classification sent representatives to interview the humans involved. But the most profound impact was felt right there in the lab, among Taiho's alien classmates. As the excitement died, down and normal classes resumed, the dynamic had completely changed. Where once there had been nervous whispers and fearful glances, now there was genuine curiosity and respect. Crixtal approached Taiho after their next class, her crystalline form shimmering with colors that indicated fascination rather than fear. Her species communicated emotion through light refraction, and right now she was practically glowing with curiosity. "Your planet," she began, her voice carrying the musical quality of wind through crystal formations. "What other creatures live there alongside humans?" Taiho leaned back in his chair, considering the question. It was clear that his fellow students were finally ready to learn about Earth beyond the simple classification of Death World. He smiled, remembering family camping trips and nature, documentaries from his childhood. "Well, there are these animals called bears," he said thoughtfully. "They're probably about 3 times the size of that Void Ripper, with claws that can tear through tree trunks and bite forces that can crush bones, but most humans think they're adorable and want to hug them." Vrakmor's feathers immediately shifted to a pale orange of alarm. "So you find creatures larger than the Void Ripper? Cute? Oh, that's nothing," So-Min chimed in, clearly enjoying the effect their words were having. "Tell them about sharks, Taiho, or better yet, tell them about wasps." Taiho's grin widened. "Wasps are these tiny flying insects, maybe the size of your fingernail. But if you disturb their nest, they'll chase you for kilometers while repeatedly stinging you with venom. And unlike most creatures, they can sting multiple times without dying." The alien students exchanged glances of horror and amazement. A Delphani student, whose aquatic species had never evolved to deal with aerial predators, made a sound like water gurgling through pipes, their equivalent of a terrified gasp. "How do you survive on such a world?" asked a Nexari student, his purple skin now showing patterns of deep concern. "We learn to understand them," Taiho said simply. "Every predator, every dangerous animal, every hostile environment, they all have patterns, behaviors, ways of communicating. Once you understand those patterns, you can coexist. Sometimes you can even become friends." Professor Quindar, who had been listening to the conversation while updating his lesson plans, suddenly stopped what he was doing. The pieces were finally falling into place. "That's why your species developed intelligence," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Most species evolve intelligence to build tools, create art, or develop technology, but humans developed intelligence to understand predators." That evening, Professor Quindar sent a priority message to the Galactic Academic Council, requesting approval for a new course in the xenobiology curriculum. Deathworlder psychology and predator dynamics would be mandatory for all students studying dangerous species. The course description noted that it would be taught by Professor Quindar, with guest lectures from the human students, who had demonstrated unprecedented success in interspecies predator communication. The first guest lecture would be delivered by Lee Taiho, the young man from Seoul who had reminded an entire galaxy that sometimes the most dangerous predator was not the one with the sharpest claws or the most powerful bite, but the one who had learned that understanding was more powerful than fear. ASD. News of the course spread throughout the galaxy. Enrollment applications poured in from academic institutions on hundreds of worlds. Everyone wanted to learn from the species that had turned a death world into a home and had taught the galaxy that even the most fearsome predators could be understood, respected, and peacefully coexisted with. Vindisei.